Today, we're near the culmination of an 8-year saga, which is my relation with Stefan Marti and his relation with the Media Lab. Stefan did some wonderful work as a master's student building a system called Active Messenger that has handled every piece of email I've gotten ever since. And sometimes I say only half in jest that I took Stefan on as a PhD student because that software was so precious to me, it needed to be maintained. I actually had some trouble working with Stefan at the beginning of his doctoral studies because Stefan really wanted to build autonomous flying vehicles. And as diverse as the Media Lab is, I couldn't really see a place for autonomous flying vehicles. Certainly it wasn't an area of my expertise, so I couldn't offer adequate critique of a project in the area. But you know, we all know how passion relates to productivity and creativity. And so it was important to tap into that passion somehow. And years later, here we are, where Stefan's passion for flying things tied in with radio-controlled devices and radio-controlled hobbyist airplanes resulted in some prototypes of little creatures like the guy in my pocket who would like to be telephones. Now, he's not a telephone yet, but I like my little guy. He sits on top of my computer. He fits quite nicely in my pocket, and I really like the idea of him turning and talking to me and waving his hands around when I got a phone call. Now, Stefan can build that kind of stuff, and he has built that kind of stuff. The challenge is, what is the deeper problem? What is it that turns, why is this a good or a bad idea to have something like this that's a telephone as opposed to something that looks like the phones that we all carry around with us? And that really is the focus of Stefan's dissertation, and I'll let him take it from here.
Thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk about my thesis work, which is titled Autonomous Interactive Intermediaries, Social Intelligence for Mobile Communication Agents. Oh, hang on a second. Yeah, hello? Sorry, this is really bad time, sorry, no, really, I can't talk. Ooh, you're offering me a job. Just a second, I need to write that down. No, I don't have anything to write down. Okay, can you just call me in 2 hours or so? Very sorry, thanks. Well, I guess you see what the problem is that I'm trying to solve. People love their mobile phones, but they hate interruptions. Specifically, co-located people hate the interruptions. I'm pretty sure about that. Co-located people like you. The solution I'm suggesting is a technology that monitors calls, converses with the caller, determines the owner's social situation, gives subtle alerts for co-located others, and allows others to influence the agent. My thesis statement is as follows. Embedding elements of human-style social intelligence into the agent that controls a user's mobile communication device or intermediary will make her device more socially acceptable, less annoying, and more useful to her and to the people around her. Here's an outline of the talk. It has 3 parts: background section, implementation section, and evaluation section. Let me start with the background. The domain of this thesis is mobile communication and user interfaces. The problem is inappropriate interruption from telecommunication. And the solution I'm suggesting is making our cell phones socially intelligent. Socially intelligent, you may ask. What does this mean? Now, if we're looking at our cell phones today, they're really powerful devices, computationally speaking, but they don't really have a lot of human-style intelligence. For example, a cell phone misses essential insights. For example, who is the caller? Now, actually, they know who the caller is. They just don't do anything about it. What is the call about? Cell phones don't know that. Who is the owner of the cell phone? How pathetic is that? My own cell phone doesn't know me. Now, what is the owner doing right now? What is the owner interested in? All these things are missing in today's cell phones. Now, there's a wealth of research that suggests a solution for this problem, and Avrahami et al. have shown a very nice problem space for all these solutions. How could a cell phone be socially intelligent? What I'm suggesting is that first, it has to move away from a passive device to an active assistant. Will such a move be acceptable for users? I'm pretty sure this will require a paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts take time, so this will not happen soon, keep this in mind. But people need trust, need time to trust such a technology. But we do this all the time. For example, if you drive down a highway with 65 mph, you trust your car that the wheels are not coming off. We have learned that the car is good enough, reliable enough that we can do that. The same has to happen with what I'm going to suggest. Why is it hard to make a cell phone behave well? Well, one of the reasons is that mobile communication is actually more complex than a classical sender-receiver scenario. There is the caller, obviously, and the callee, but there's also collocated people. And as Love et al. Showed in a study they did last year, collocated people are actually trying to disconnect from a call if it happens in their proximity, but they still can understand perfectly what the call is about and can and remember all the details about the call, even though they don't want to, perhaps. So a specific focus of this work is on the third party, these collocated people. One of the ways I suggest that the mobile cell phone should deal with these things is to become an intermediary, a more proactive device, to deal with all these parties. How might this be accomplished? This might appear actually as an AI complete problem. If a cell phone behaves perfectly appropriate at all the times, every time I get a phone call, knows all these things that I just mentioned before, I might have solved AI as a whole, and I don't think I'm doing this at all. So instead, what I'm suggesting is something more like a human-assisted AI. So we want to give little feedback to the agent that controls my cell phone so that it behaves the right way. It's also going in the same direction that I think one does not understand a problem if one doesn't have several perspectives on this problem. Now, being a proactive cell phone is difficult. Even humans tend to give priority to a calling party when a conversation. So it's not easy, I have to say. The approach I am suggesting is the following. We need multiple sources of social intelligence. These sources have to be independent from each other and stand for different perspectives to the same problem. There is no point in building a system where we need 5 sources of social intelligence, and if one is missing, the whole system breaks. It will just get brittle. It has to do the best with whatever is available. Now, the intermediary doesn't have this social intelligence, but I would think that it should rather harvest residual social intelligence from both human and non-human sources. There are the following sources for social intelligence. First of all, this is a nice diagram of a situation with me and the remote person. And the remote person is separate from me by a gap. Most of the time a space gap, unless you're talking to me on the phone right beside me. And sometimes it's also a time gap when you leave a voicemail message. Right in the middle is where the intermediary should sit. There are, as I've said, 4 sources that I could think of. First of all, why don't we ask me, the owner of the cell phone, what this is about? What's my situation? What am I interested in? The second source of intelligence would be the remote person. The person who calls me obviously knows what they want to know. They know what the call is about. They probably also know their relationship to me. But then there are collocated people. They're also involved. Why don't we ask the collocated people what is socially appropriately at a given time? And as a fourth source, we are not just in a vacuum. We are in certain spaces. And the space actually varies. If we are in a location like here, it's very clear what the communication behavior should be. Because this is an auditorium, you probably have your cell phones turned off. However, if you're in the kitchen or in a cafeteria, then you probably have your cell phone on because there's absolutely no reason to turn it off. So why don't we ask the space itself what is appropriate to do? So these are the 4 sources that I'm going to suggest. Now, is this a complete solution? No, it definitely isn't, since the AI will be incomplete. But I think it's sometimes better to have a little intelligence about the situation and no intelligence at all, at least in the most of the time. And I'm suggesting a fail-safe. The main problem that can happen is that the cell phone fails to interrupt me at the right time. Now, what if we would build a cell phone that would interrupt me with socially appropriate behavior? So this means we're not asking only for an intermediary that reasons with social intelligence, but also behaves with social intelligence. Now, behaving with social intelligence, what would this be? Current mobile communication devices have very limited expressive capabilities. In essence, they can either ring or vibrate. Okay, they can ring in a gazillion different ringtones, but still, it's just the audio channel or the tactile channel in a limited way. Whereas, if you look at how humans interrupt and alert, it's very different. If I'm in a conversation with somebody, and somebody else wants to interrupt me, walks up to me, what they do is probably they try to seek eye contact, gaze. If I don't react, or if I don't see them, they start to probably wave, and these are very, very subtle cues. Most of these cues are actually nonverbal cues, and they are almost hard-coded to us. We have a lot of experience interpreting and using these nonverbal cues. Now, why don't we just enhance our cell phones with human-style nonverbal capabilities? So why don't we give them more intuitive behavior? The problem is that a cell phone these days consists of a screen, a keypad, and a loudspeaker. So it's pretty difficult to imagine how it could actually do like eye contact and wave at me. So what I'm suggesting is to embody the intermediary in an animatronic device. The advantage is clearly that the interaction between the intermediary and me, and actually also the co-located people like you, is not just limited to the audio and tactile domain. And the main use of such an animatronics would be being able to use human-style nonverbal cues for interruptions. I'm actually not talking about a full-blown interaction between me and the intermediary. It's only about interruptions and alerting. In summary, what I suggest is to harvest residual social intelligence from multiple sources and make an intermediary behave in a socially intelligent way. Let me move on to the second part of my presentation, the implementation. As I've said before, the main issues for implementing an autonomous interactive intermediary would be how to make it reason with social intelligence and how to make it behave in a socially appropriate way. First, I will show 4 technologies that cover the first point, and then 2 technologies about the second point. Actually, first, before I begin, the implementation I can describe in a very short way. Take a cell phone, breed it with a cute animatronic animal, and add a bit of agent intelligence to make it behave right. Keep this in mind if you get lost with all the technologies that I'm going to suggest now. It's actually very simple. So, reasoning with social intelligence. As I've said before, there might be 4 sources for such social intelligence. And what I'm suggesting is to gather clues from all 4 sources. The first of all is from getting social intelligence from me. What I'm suggesting is that we need to know my conversational status, the user's conversational status. The technology that does that is the conversation finder subsystem. The second source of intelligence, co-located people, should be involved as well, and I'm suggesting something called social polling to get them involved. The third source would be the user and caller common interests, pretty much taking into account what the caller knows about the call, and I'm going to suggest issue detection as a system that deals with that. The fourth source, as I've said, deals with the room, the knowledge that the room has about interactions, and I'm going to show you room memory, which deals with that. Conversation Finder. Conversation Finder subsystem determines the user's conversational status. It's built on as a network of body-worn wireless sensor nodes, like the one you see on the left, and they're built to actually answer two basic questions. How many people are in my conversation? Second of all, what's the percentage of talking versus listening? Now, if I have a value of like, there are 0 people in the user's conversation and he's talking 100% of the time, I'm probably on another phone. If I am in a conversation with 10 people and I talk only 3% of the time, probably I'm attending to a talk. This is the kind of information that the conversation finders can deliver. And an intermediary can query them for this kind of information. What it is actually is it's a little PCB, double-sided PCB board that is worn close to the neck. It has a binary speech detector, low-range radio transceivers, which communicate asynchronously on a single channel. So what they essentially do is they send out messages and listen to messages from other conversation finder badges. They are completely autonomous and it's decentralized, so there is no central place where the information is collected. They come independently to a decision about what's going on or what they think is going on. Now, in order to find conversational groupings, I'm using a technique that was suggested by Sumit Basu a few years ago. We look at the alignment of speech. It's based on the idea that if I'm in a conversation with somebody or some people, the spoken language does not overlap significantly for more than 2 or 3 seconds. Unless I'm perhaps Italian or really angry at you, then it's different. But other than that, if you look at this example where there are 4 talkers, 4 speakers, green gives a turn to blue, orange, and they just take turns. So this looks like they are in a conversation with each other. However, later in the conversation, green is still very nicely aligned with black, but black is definitely not aligned with blue, so they overlap a lot here and here. So the conversation finder of green can say, black is probably my conversation, but blue probably isn't. Now this system does not work all the time, but it works a lot, and it's actually very robust. Let me continue, let me go on to the next source of social intelligence. Social polling. This is taking into account the collocated people. It allows participants of collocated conversations to veto. Now, the intermediary can poll all these participants of collocated conversations out about the appropriateness of an interruption. It is actually based on the conversation finder nodes because the conversation finders can distinguish between people who are close by and people who are close by and in an interaction with me. We don't want to actually poll all the people who are close by, just the people who are part of my conversation. This is the kind of socialist approach almost. Keep in mind that the responsibility is almost collaborative because what we're asking is that the people veto to an interruption that is for the group. It's not just for them, but it's for the group. So the alerting happens in a very subtle way. Their fingering vibrates slightly. If you want to veto to an interruption, you just touch your fingering. It works because there is a micro switch on it, and when you press this switch, a short message gets sent to the intermediary. Now, the fingering vibrates actually when anyone in my group gets a call, not just I am getting the call. So I don't know which phone is about to ring when I'm vetoing. But the basic idea is when I veto to an interruption, I just block this interruption. Let me show you how this works with real people. The scenario we have here is that there's Dana, who is about to call Albert. Albert is in a conversation, is in the same room with 2 other people, but in a conversation with Ben. Claudia is also here, but she's not really part of the conversation. So Albert and Ben are talking, all 3 people wearing conversation finder badges close to their neck. All of them wear fingering nodes that can alert them. When Dana calls, the call is actually intercepted by the intermediary. It doesn't go directly to your cell phone, otherwise you wouldn't have a lot of control on it. So it gets intercepted by the computer here, and the first thing the intermediary does, it actually sends a short message to Albert's conversation finder node and asks for his conversational status. Pretty much how many people are there, And the node responds by saying there's another person in this conversation, and he's talking 50% of the time. After that, the intermediary broadcasts a message to all conversation finder nodes in range. And it asks, if you think you are in a conversation with Albert, with my owner, let your finger ring vibrate. This means we do not need to know who is part of the conversation because we just broadcast and let all the conversation finder nodes decide if they are inversely involved with Albert. Since Claudia's conversation finder node doesn't think she's part of the conversation, only Ben's and Albert's fingering are about to vibrate. And Albert is probably very busy like I am right now and is gesturing and doing all these things and probably missed the slight alert, but Ben didn't, and he thought that it would be not appropriate to get an interruption, presses the finger ring very slightly, unobtrusively, and sends back a signal to the intermediary. This interruption by touching the finger is a very subtle gesture. It's because you can do that even when you do stuff with your hands. Whereas if you say, oh, that's just the same thing as turning off your cell phone, this means you have to take out your cell phone, press the button, everybody sees what you're doing. Even if you're doing it on a watch, you have to use both hands. Touching the finger is a very subtle gesture. Let's move on to the next source of social intelligence. I think I would prefer to take questions at the end, but if you want, is this okay? Okay. No. I mean, there's nothing about this in here. Ben knows that there is going to be a call. That's it. But I can elaborate on that if you want. Let me move on to the next source of intelligence, which would be the calling party. The idea is that we're actually listening to what the caller has to say. I mean, the caller knows what the call is about, obviously. So we're trying to get a relevance of an incoming call from the user. We do speech recognition on the caller. Now, if you're familiar with speech recognition, you know that this will not work well. We have a recognition rate of 30 or 40%, so there's no way that we can really understand in depth what the caller actually means. So I'm suggesting something else. I'm suggesting to match the recognized words of the conversation with the caller with what the agent or the intermediary knows about what's on my mind. Now, what's on my mind is harvested continuously, actually every hour, continuously, from several sources several personal sources. These are my to-do list, my web searches, and the email message I've sent. So if I've sent a lot of email messages recently about my defense and I really have to get the slides done, and somebody calls and mentions words like slides and defense, the importance of the call gets erased. The fourth source of social intelligence would have been the room memory. So how do people usually deal with mobile communication here specifically? I've already mentioned the example with movie theater versus cafeteria. So it's about gathering information on how mobile communication devices are used in a certain location at a certain time. There is a server that registers all communication events. For example, if a user picked up the phone, if a user turned off the phone, and in our system specifically also, if collocated people vetoed to conversation, and also the conversational setting at the point when this happens. Room memory creates a profile, a specific profile, that can be queried by the intermediary at the beginning of a call. Let's move on to the second part of how to behave in a socially intelligent way. The intermediary is implemented in two domains. First of all, it's implemented in the spoken language domain. So it's a dual conversational agent. It can talk to the caller, obviously, but it can also talk to me. It's also implemented in the nonverbal domain as an animatronic device, which is very useful for me because I see this device, and actually also to the collocated people. It's interesting for all of us because we share the same physical space. The dual conversational agent is mediating between caller and user. It's kind of similar to an interactive voice response system. So we use digitized speech, we do speech recognition on the caller side, but it's actually doing much more than a normal IVR system because, first of all, it's dual. It can interact with both sides, caller and me at the same time. It can suggest communication mode changes. For example, if somebody calls and I'm kind of busy, but it's okay for me to receive a short message, the intermediary can suggest that the caller leaves a short voice instant message, waits on the phone, I get this voice instant message, if I have time I will reply, and the person on the phone gets the reply. It's kind of like instant messaging, but just in the voice domain. It is definitely different from normal IVRs because it behaves differently towards the two sides. On the caller side, it's very polite. Well, the person is calling me, so you don't want to annoy the person. But on my side, it can be a bit more terse and more efficient. I might be busy in a conversation, so I don't have to have all these polite phrases back and forth. So it behaves differently towards both sides. The dual conversational agent is implemented as a finite state machine, and I'm going to walk you now through a little example, a simplified example. When a call comes in, the first thing it does, before the caller even hears anything or a prompt, it checks the caller ID, it checks the user's conversational status with the conversation finder badges, and it pre-alerts the collocated people. It vibrates the people who are in my conversation. It vibrates the finger rings. Then the caller hears a prompt, something like, would you like to leave a voicemail message or a voice instant message? If the caller decides to leave a voicemail message, then the system behaves like a normal voicemail system. However, if he or she chooses voice instant messages, we take into account if we actually know the caller from caller ID. If we know the caller, we let her record a voice instant message, then play this voice instant message back to me, to the user, and wait for a reply, and then play back this reply on the side of the caller. If we do not know the caller, we add an additional step. We ask her first, or the intermediary rather ask her first, what is this call about? We record the caller, and there comes issue detection into the game, and we try to match the words that we recognize from her conversation with what might be on my mind. If we detect some issues, then we let her go on and record a voice message, etc. If not, we send her directly to voicemail. That's an example interaction, but it's of course not the only one, because the user can always send the caller to voicemail or talk to him or her directly by interacting with the animatronics device. Also, collocated people's vetoes let the caller go to voicemail directly. So the idea is that if somebody really vetoes to this interruption, there is no point in going on. And eventually, there is a barge-in feature which detects emergency keywords. So if my mom calls and says, oh, I don't care about all this conversational thing, your dad just had an accident and is at the hospital, we actually stop the prompt and do some speech recognition on these interruptions and detect certain emergency keywords like hospital, death, and accident. In this case, everything gets bypassed and the caller gets connected directly to the user. The second part of the behaving with social intelligence is the animatronic device. The goal is to use human-style nonverbal cues for subtle but public alerting. These are gaze and gestures. There are three main purposes for embodying an agent. First of all, it allows us to convey subtly what's going on the telephone domain. As a simple example, the intermediary, the animatronics, wakes up in a different way depending on who is calling, and also wakes up in a different way depending on how important the call might be. It also serves as a natural focus point for attention. For example, if I have my intermediary in front of me on the table, and we share this table line in our conversation, it starts to wake up, we all see that it's waking up. It's very clear to all of us what's going on. And finally, the alerts and interrupts are in a subtle but public way. This goes back to what Hansen et al. Suggested, that the design space for alerts is actually a two-dimensional space. On one side, publicity, and the other side, subtlety. For example, a ringing phone is very public, but it's also very obtrusive, versus a vibration, a phone that vibrates in my pocket is private, but also very subtle. However, they found that the optimal alerting cues would actually be public yet subtle. Nonverbal cues happen to be this kind of interruption. Now, when I say animatronic device, a lot of people think of the scary animatronics they see in theme parks. What I'm thinking more about is something cute that you can wear, perhaps on your shoulder. Perhaps it's small and you can put it in your chest pocket like Chris just showed, or you just have it in your hand. Now I'm going to talk about the 3 generations of animatronics that I actually built. The 3 generations are different in their capabilities. The first one is a parrot, the second one a bunny, and the third one a squirrel. I'll explain what's different about these things. The parrot is a very beautiful red macaw, and I've added animatronics stuff inside, which is actually RC stuff from RC airplanes. And we use a remote brain approach, so we actually control the animatronics from a remote computer. And as you can see, this guy has 4 degrees of freedom, the head moving up and down, left, right, and the wings flapping. They can actually flap independently. The main problem with the parrot was, it's very nice to on Halloween, of course, but it's actually a bit too big to carry around. And it also doesn't have any audio at this point, but it's still very expressive, the way it can flap its wings and move its head. So the next animatronics I built was like half the size, or even much smaller. It was a cute little bunny. Again, I had to rip the internals out and put animatronics stuff inside. This time it was actually micro RC stuff because it's just so small. And again, I use a computer remote control approach. And the big difference to the parrot is actually that it has an audio link to the intermediary. The audio link is actually an analog two-way radio, like a push-to-talk radio, although I would think it's probably more like squeeze ear-to-talk radio. We actually had the push-to-talk button in the ear. Still, the problem was that it was very limited range, and had a very limited range, and the transmitters were really bulky, like the RC transmitter, and then there was a walkie-talkie on the computer side, so it was getting really bulky. Here is how this little cute animal looks like without its skin. You can see that it has similar degrees of freedom, like head moving up and down. It has actually 2 very nice eyes. As I've said, gaze is very important for interruption, so I paid attention to make very nice eyes with eyelids that open both sides. It's oversized, of course. It's very tiny. The animatronics actually, as I've said, has these 4 degrees of freedom, so it can't run. So you hold it, and it tries to get our attention by looking around and opening the eyes and, flopping its ears. So here's a longer sequence where the bunny, the normal state of the bunny is asleep, so it breathes slightly, it sighs a little bit. Then at some point, when a call comes in, we don't hear that as a user. We don't hear the call. We just see that the bunny is waking up, the eyes are opening. It looks around a little bit, still sleepy. Then it really needs to get the user's attention and gets a bit more nervous and more excited. But in this video, nobody interacts with it. So at some point, it just gives up and calms down again and gets a bit more sleepy. And you see this with the eyes. It gives up and eventually it shakes its head in disbelief that nobody pays attention and goes back to sleep. The 3rd generation of animatronics I built was a cellular squirrel. Now, the mechanics are very similar to the bunny. The main difference is that we improved the data and audio link remarkably. As an audio link, the audio link is now duplex. This means I can have a full-blown duplex phone conversation with the other person. That was not possible with the half-duplex half-duplex radio that the bunny had. It also has a full duplex data connection, which means that the intermediary is aware of the states of the switches in at the extremities. It has switches in the paws. Its range is 40 meters, which pretty much covers the 3rd floor of the Media Lab. We use a Bluetooth Class 1 transceiver with an extended antenna. Here it just woke up, and you have seen it's waking up in a more abrupt way, so probably the call is more important. Again, it looks around, and again, in this example, the user is ignoring the bunny, so sorry, squirrel, and so it gives up and goes to sleep again. Again, just a short sequence. All the animatronics are controlled by a piece of software, the animatronics server, which combines a character behavior creation tool and a hub. On one side, here with the sliders, the character designer can influence all the degrees of freedom very easily. And similar to musical sequencing software, you can record sequences of behaviors and create like atomic behaviors such as blinking, turning head. Then you store these behaviors and combine all these atomic behaviors to more complex behavior, composite behavior, such as waking up, which may be something like you get up, look around, you blink a little bit. And eventually, it interfaces with the conversational agent software, which sends high-level commands to the server, like we just got a call from a user that we don't know, and it translates this situation into a behavior. The advantage of this software is that you can plug in pretty much any kind of animatronics, even if it's a different type, and you just modify the low-level behavior, whereas the conversational agents always can send the same signals to the control server. Let me move on to the third part of my presentation, the evaluation. I was looking into the most controversial features of an autonomous interactive intermediary, and these are the following. First of all, vetoing to a group interruption. Will this work? The second one is animatronics that interrupts. Is this really less intrusive than a phone? First of all, group vetoing to an interruption. The hypothesis is that if participants are given the means to anonymously veto upcoming cell phone interruptions by responding to a subtle pre-alert in the form of slight vibration on their fingering, they will veto more during a group-focused setting. Or in short, when interruption would disturb, will veto, otherwise won't. The user study consisted of teams of participants who played a card game and were rewarded for the group performance. They were interrupted by phone calls and were rewarded for responses, like if they were asked, like, what's 7 times 15, and if they could answer, which was an easy question, they would get an individual reward. There were 2 conditions: busy during a game, and then relaxed in between games. For this study, we actually used the wired fingering, the one that you see on the right side. Again, you can do a lot of things. Even when you're holding cards, you can actually veto, because it's just touching the finger. Here is an example of the relaxed condition. People laugh, shuffling cards. The person on the left just got an interruption. Since nobody cared about this, nobody vetoed, so the phone was ringing, and they're just relaxing. They're happy that he gets an additional individual award, and they're just waiting for the next game to start. Whereas here, we see an example for busy condition. People are very focused on playing the game, and every interruption would draw away attention from one person to the game and would block the whole game. So they would veto in this situation.
Jack.
They're actually wearing finger rings, as you can see here, all of them. They're also vetoing during this time. Results. I issued 15 pre-alerts in each condition. 15 pre-alerts during the busy condition and 15 during the relaxed condition. Then we measured how many vetoes we actually got back. And it turns out that we got significantly more vetoes during the game than in between the games. In short, the participants vetoed significantly more in this high-stress, group-focused situation than in the pauses in between. Findings is, people will veto calls when appropriate. However, of course, we could think of many other kinds of voting models that are possible. For example, right now, if I veto to a call, it just blocks everything. You could think of a majority approach where you need like 50% of the people present vetoing to interrupt the conversation. or you can say that my advisor has a different weight in its veto compared to me. Let me talk about the second user study that I did, which is about animatronics interruption. The hypothesis was interruptions of a social setting caused by human-style nonverbal alerts are perceived by bystanders as less annoying and less intrusive than interruptions by a ringing phone. In short, the ringing phone is more annoying than animatronics. The user study was a one-on-one interview setting, which was inspired by Love et al. They studied a year ago the effects of cell phones on bystanders. And although the bystanders really wanted to disconnect when people were taking phone calls in their proximity, they really could recall exactly all the details of the conversation. In our setting, the interview got interrupted by 2 calls. One was by phone call, and the other one was by the squirrel waking up. Each of these interruptions resulted in a 30-second phone conversation. They were both in speakerphone, so the participant actually heard the whole conversation. The conversation through the body went completely through the squirrel, came completely from the squirrel. In order to avoid animatronics novelty, we exposed the participants first to a kind of digital zoo. When they came in to the experimental area, there were a lot of things moving around, and the experimenter had an animatronic cat on his lap, and so we tried to desensitize them to all these moving things. Otherwise, it would have been very difficult to show that a moving animatronic is less annoying than a phone. After the interview, we gave them questionnaires to describe the interruptions to interruptions. One of them was a semantic differential. This is a method by Osgood which measures attitudes and attitude changes, attitude differences. It's made of bipolar scales like weak and strong, tense and relaxed, and the participants go through this list and mark on these scales where they think the interruption was. We also gave them a normal survey and had a semi-structured interview afterwards. The findings are as follows. When asked directly, would you rather be interrupted by a phone or by the squirrel, 6 said the squirrel, 4 didn't have really a preference, and 0 preferred the phone. Now, asking people directly such a question is not really relevant all the time because there are many reasons why people would say stuff like that and actually think something else. So we asked a bit less direct, how annoying was the interruption? 1 was very annoying and 6 not at all. And it turns out that the squirrel was significantly less annoying than the phone interruption. Eventually, what we did, we compared the scales of the semantic differential. It turns out that if you just compare each scale with each other, pairwise, the squirrel was rated as much more progressive, friendly, humorous, fresh, fun, relaxed, bright, and feminine. This means the semantic differential, which measures connotative meaning versus denotative meaning, is actually looking rather at an emotional than rational aspect of this problem. And the difference in ring versus squirrel is that they actually not consistently prefer the squirrel, as we have seen at least 4 out of 10 did not have any preference, but the affective attitudes differ significantly and consistently. There were no gender or recency effects. For example, it was not the case that the second interruption was more annoying than the first one. Then we asked them what they really thought about this. And there were a lot of positive reactions like, it amused me, I didn't mind it at all. I like it, I wouldn't mind one in my house, I think it's cool, I want one. Then we asked them what they thought about the intrusiveness of it. I find it a lot less objectionable. Another person said, it's the cutest, it's a different way, phones are so sterile, I hate ringing phones, blaring phones. The phone ringing is definitely much more invasive than what this is doing. I do think it would be less invasive to the conversation what this was doing than even just a ringing phone, even if he decided not to pick it up. There were a few negative reactions, like I don't think it makes the cell phone any less offensive in offensive situations, and Just because it is dressed up as a cute squirrel doesn't mean in a restaurant and somebody's squirrel's rings, it will be just as annoying. Interesting was also that actually half of the participants did not notice when the squirrel was waking up. They only noticed when the interviewer was starting to interact with the squirrel. This means the interruption by the squirrel was definitely not, almost a bit too subtle and definitely not too obtrusive. Let me move on to the possible extensions of my system. It would be really nice if the system would allow direct feedback from the user so that the user could give specific policies like, don't let this person interrupt me. It would also be very nice if the intermediary could learn from the user and you could just say, don't do this again. Whatever happened before, don't do this again. Nice would be also to allow bystanders to understand interruptions. Right now, we're just trying to make the interruptions less objectionable, less annoying. Perhaps it makes a difference if bystanders would understand why I'm getting interrupted. Then we actually are not looking at time-critical interruptions. We're looking only at important interruptions. But sometimes it makes sense to distinguish between timely and important interruptions. Like some interruptions are just very, very important, but it doesn't matter if it's right now. And some are just very timely, but it's not very important, like if there's food in the third floor. Now, the relevance of the call to the current conversation would be something really nice to have. So if somebody calls and talks about something that we are right now discussing in our co-located conversation, that would be very interesting to know. Now I come to the contributions. I have developed an autonomous interactive intermediary for mobile communication that actively mediates between user, caller, and co-located people. It's a dual conversational agent that interacts simultaneously with both user and caller. It's physically embodied to use intuitive and human-style nonverbal cues and harvests residual social intelligence from human and other sources. Some final thoughts. What I'm asking here is actually for a paradigm shift from a passive tool to an intermediary. Will people accept such a proactive, novel technology? Let me put this another way. When phones first got introduced to homes, did people like the fact that they could get interrupted at any time? No, they hated it. Later, when answering machines were invented, did people like them? No, they hated talking to machines. But these days, if you don't have an answering machine, people complain. A few years ago, when you were walking down the street and just talking to yourself, people were looking at you and say, this guy is really strange. He talks to himself. But later, we learned that he was just talking on his cell phone. These days, if somebody walks down the street and just talks to himself, gesturing wildly in the air, the only thing we do is we look for a thin wire coming out of his ear. If he has this wire, everything's okay. So, social norms change. Our expectations change, but if we are open to such changes, an interesting and fascinating future may await us. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank also to people who were very, very important to this thesis, like my thesis committee, Chris Schmant, Henry Lieberman, Cynthia Brazil, my Genius Europs, the speech group, present and past members, my friends here, my friends back in Switzerland, the Media Lab as a whole, of course, my family at home in Switzerland, my parents, my siblings, and of course my family here, Kimiko and Nena. Thank you very much.
Well, I thought my little cutie was a boy, but the subject sure said it was a girl.
Hi. I have two questions. One is, if I'm an obnoxious caller, I could just tell the intermediary, hospital, accident, whatever. Would the person who I'm calling find out that I'm actually tricking the agent or not?
This is the part that I have not implemented. Of course, you could say, if you had this feature that you say, don't do this again, as soon as this happens once, you tell the intermediary whatever happens in the past, like this person, this specific person trying to trick me, it should learn that. I did not deal with this question, no. But it would be nice to have.
So you aren't told what conversation the intermediary had with the caller, or how the caller somehow got through. You don't get that information as the callee.
No,
Right
you know that. You know that.
Yeah.
I mean, since we're doing speech recognition, and this actually is done on the finite state machine, each of these states of the conversational agent can trigger certain behaviors. So depending who is calling, why we get interrupted, and all these things can be sort of acted out by the animatronics in some ways.
And the other question that I have is, why does the conversational agent need to be polite and use all this extra language when talking to the caller? Because after all, it's just a machine, right? And we'll get used to this, and I think the callers will also want to just have a very efficient interface, just like the person who is being called.
I think this would be, again, something that you can adjust. If we really know who the caller is and the caller has a preference, we could build a system that learns these things. It could learn that this caller just doesn't want to bother with all this polite stuff and just want to get cut to the chase. Well, it was pretty much a first try to make sure that the conversational agent is actually polite, which is a part of being socially intelligent. You don't want to piss off people on the phone. Andy?
I want to ask my question that I was getting to before there. So let me understand the scenario correctly. I'm sitting around in a group and my daughter calls me, and the rest of the people in the group who don't know my daughter can veto whether I can receive the call from my daughter unless she says the word hospital or pregnant.
Well, you could do that. That's approximately correct. Now, the idea is that something has to change in your brain before you can actually use such a system, because it means you cannot be selfish or egocentric, because you don't know whose call is going to interrupt us. If you are really sure that this is not a good time to interrupt, then it's okay. However, you of course can instruct your intermediary to say, my daughter is in a special call group, and this just has much higher priority than what vetoes do.
But it's eliding the question to say that I can exempt everyone from the problem. Okay, that's cheating, because then obviously we would exempt ourselves out of your thesis. So let's not go that far. Let's stay within the problem. Okay, now how much of what you're doing here applies in the universe of telephony versus in the rest of the universe of social interactions? I.e., if my daughter were to walk up to me while I were in that group, and other people in the group who may or may not have known her would veto her ability to interact or interrupt my conversation that was going on in the group, would that be reasonable? Or does this follow or apply to that case? Or likewise, if I were to walk up to you and try to gain your attention instead of by using eye contact, by waving a bunny, in a physical interaction, would that be part of the universe of your thesis? Or is a telephone interaction so uniquely different that it invents its own universe?
I think I'm actually trying to mix them more than we do right now. Right now, the domain of phone and phone interruption, phone conversation is very distinct from our physical interactions, right? We have our different rules when you talk to each other versus when you are on the phone. And I think part of what I'm suggesting is to bring these two domains a bit closer. I don't think you can marry them and can completely transfer the rules of our physical interaction to the rules of a phone conversation, but you can make them closer.
So I guess following on with Andy's question, when there are people physically co-located and one of them gets a phone call, does that and their ring vibrates as well as the rings of everyone in that conversation, is it clear who the call is for?
No, that's completely not clear.
So in a sense, you're sort of valuing the physical conversation or honoring the physical conversation over the interruption.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, the only thing I'm saying is you do not know if the call is for you, but you can definitely sort of guess if it's appropriate to get an interruption at all. If you are in an engaged conversation with 3 people, I mean, it doesn't matter who gets the call, it just interrupts. And I'm just trying to figure out, would it be, or the users have to figure out, is it appropriate to get interrupted, not necessarily who or why at that point.
I'm interested in the idea of scale. Have you thought about what our threshold is for being surrounded by a digital zoo? If we have 10 little animatronic things in a meeting, are you going to have to change how they behave to draw more attention to them?
At one point, I had an element in my thesis where I said intermediaries talking to each other. This would probably address what you just asked for. So definitely it makes a difference. If I'm the only person who has my bunny sitting on the table, it's probably different from if there are 10. And I would think that you're right, that they have to adjust their behavior a little bit so that we're not, I mean, it's probably an accumulative effect of all of them breathing and sneezing and sighing.
I'll give it to you, Stefan, when I'm done. I want to know what the advantages of having an anthropomorphic form in this particular context. So I can understand why in certain contexts there are benefits to having a human-like or socially appropriate intermediary. But what is the advantage in this particular context?
You're asking about anthropomorphic versus, what's the alternative?
A light that goes on and off, something that jiggles, something that vibrates.
Well, the hope is that the anthropomorphic feature is actually more intuitive. If something wakes up in a very energetic way and is very nervous, it just means something else than if something gets up and is a bit sleepy and looks around. It's just more intuitive. You can also encode a lot of information in the behavior. And this is not intuitive, but you could make your bunny or your squirrel wake up in different ways who's calling, and it's kind of a very expressive space where you can define behaviors that mean certain specific things. Whereas if you have to encode all this information in a light or 2 lights or 3 lights, it's a bit less intuitive, I would think.
Okay.
Hi, I've got 2 questions also. The first is sort of a minor one. Were the little vibrators that people wore on their fingers, were they really silent, or were they sort of vibrating in the same way that cell phones vibrate? It's always kind of funny to me that they go into silent mode, but they're really not silent at all. They're still quite loud.
They were below perceivable audio level, but they are not silent, actually. Now, it's actually very important because I experiment a lot with what kind of vibration works on a fingering without being audible. It was the intention to not make it audible. So I cut the voltage to about 10% of the original voltage for the motor, so it vibrates very slightly and you do not hear anything at all. If you would have a normal pager motor at 100% of its voltage, you would hear it definitely. Now the problem is also that if you have your hand on a table, it resonates and you would hear that as well. But as long as you don't touch anything massive, you will not hear it at all.
Okay, and just a second question then, which is that everything that you presented here seems to be trying to solve the problem of not being interrupted when receiving mobile phone calls and that kind of thing. So my question is, have you come across any research that would say something about why that's an important problem to solve? Or why do you think that's a significant problem to solve in the world? And I don't mean that in an aggressive way. I mean in just really that, is there research that you've come across that says if we can solve this problem of interruptions in mobile phone calls, that, X% of contracts will be signed as opposed to, aborted or something like that?
I don't think that's the case. I don't know of any such research, in short. But I have a feeling that although currently this might not be such a big problem, the interruptions by cell phones, it might get out of hand. I have a feeling, and I don't like this, but I have a feeling that we will get also spam on our cell phones very soon, and a lot. And so you have to think about a filtering mechanism, and what I'm suggesting is pretty much an intelligent filtering mechanism. Henry?
So I guess, we have this problem, even without cell phones, we have this problem, even with landline phones of sort of getting in, even without cell phones, even with landline phones, there's a problem of sometimes getting too many calls or interruptions, and very important people always have you can't just call the CEO of a company, there's always some secretary who then has to decide whether to pass the call through, to interrupt you if you're in a meeting, so some of the same decisions. So could you compare a little bit to that situation? And I know you didn't want it to be AI complete, so you're declaiming solving the problem completely, but what role do you see for AI and for content-based, decision-making about interruptions and whether to receive calls?
Perhaps I'm very interested in that, but I have to mention that this thesis is mainly in user interface and in telecommunication domain, not necessarily in AI. So I might just scratch the surface there. It definitely would be very interesting if the AI actually had more understanding of the situation in a broader sense. And we have talked about that in the past. Of course, it would be a perfect domain to include common sense knowledge. I don't really see an easy way of making an AI or an intermediary that has just even slightly the same capabilities that an administrative assistant has. I mean, we're just not there yet, and I don't really see how we can do that in the near future. But then again, as I've said, I'm not really into AI, and I can't really say how much can be done in the near future. But I'm kind of suspicious that we're not getting very far right now.
There's a fair amount of overhead on the part of the users to have to wear the communication finder badge and the ring and so forth. And I'm just wondering, in terms of a group, if somebody forgets to wear their badge or doesn't like their ring or something, how does the performance of your system degrade with, say, non-compliant or even just forgetful users?
First of all, I would think that a lot of these things that I've shown are really prototypes. So eventually, I would think that, for example, the conversation finder node might be integrated in your Bluetooth headset or something like that. So or it's integrated in your phone somehow. Same way that your fingering might be just part of your jewelry. So most of the jewelry that would just come with a little chip which does all these things. So it's less likely that you forget something. However, I am pretty sure that it degrades gracefully in some ways. So if there are 5 people and only 2 or 3 have their fingerings on, it's actually enough if one person vetoes to this fingering. And it actually doesn't really matter if we see that there are 3 or 4 people because we missed the 4th one because he or she didn't have their conversation finder badge on. It's okay to have a general idea what the conversation is on. So I would think it's not crucial that everybody has all the technology with him or her all the time.
Hi, Stefan. It's really great work. Especially the problem is very well known, but the solution you propose is very unique and very surprising. And I've been thinking about the implication of the research, not necessarily only the real-time interruptions by cell phone. Of course, now people shifting towards more store and forward asynchronous communication because people believe that is less intrusive. But the reality is, number of the email or the impatient colleagues waiting for the reply also become very intrusive. Even already in the many meetings or even CC defense, people bring computers. Then some people may also doing the email. So I'm just interested about, you focus on the real-time interruptions by cell phone, but your architecture or thinking or methods might be also applicable. Or maybe we really need to tackle the real issue is how to manage attention, how to help people prioritize all the work in spite of call come in real time or asynchronous. So I'm very much interested in hearing your view, how to challenge this most profound problem of the information age.
Okay. And thank you very much for this question. It's a very interesting question. I think the reason why I have focused on synchronous voice communication is just because of the setting. However, in my head, I always had the idea that that an intermediary or the concept of intermediary can, of course, be extended to a lot of other things. You can extend it to email, of course. It can do the same thing with email. I did actually a lot of this with my master's project, but what's more interesting is if people accept this paradigm of an intermediary, you could extend this method, this idea very easily to something else. For example, you could have an intermediary that interacts on one side with me and on the other side with, say, your home, your house. It could talk two different languages on both sides, and the same way that we interact with the intermediary who mediates between me and the remote person, you could actually say the remote party could be a complex piece of technology, like a house, and you have a high-level conversation via your intermediary about your house or with your house. It's specifically interesting if the two entities, the remote person and me, are not talking the same language. So there's a lot of things that you can extend, and we thought about, well, you could have an intermediary that actually mediates between me and my dog, or me and something else really complex that just doesn't speak my language. So there's a lot of potential how you could expand this idea of an intermediary. But definitely you could include all the other devices that try to get our attention, like well, all the things that interrupt us, like our laptop with asynchronous messages and other similar things.
Thank you. I forgot to mention that my daughter, 8 months old, definitely like an interface than any other cellular phone. So I really want to have one squirrel for my daughter once it's get available. Thank you.
Let me just add to that last answer, Hiroshi, that Stefan did email for his master's thesis, and email is so much easier than voice, than synchronous voice. There's much more data, email is much more structured, header fields have a lot more information, it's much more asynchronous. It's really a challenge to do things synchronously because somebody else is on the other end of the phone line and you've got to make your decisions in real time in order to handle the call. Any other questions? If not, we'll thank Stefan.